Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into conflict resolution. And so the episode is called It's Not About the Dishes, and this stems from a really funny video that I watched that I thought was really good. So conflict resolution in couples is different than other types of conflict, and it's because there isn't a power differential, or at least there shouldn't be a power differential.
And I think we have to say at the outset that might be a bias that you and I have that may not be shared by a lot of people. I mean, I think there are some couples. I think they tend to be in fundamental religious groups where they really don't believe in that there is a true power differential between the husband and the wife. But we're approaching it from the aspect that there shouldn't be.
Right. And I also think that it merits talking about, and there might be some areas where your spouse can have power over the other, right? So that does happen in conflict resolution. So if you think about, like,
I'm curious what you think might be the situation.
Okay, so I'm thinking of just the way that Curtis and I have divided the labor of our home. Maybe you can make sense out of this, right?
Oh, but that makes sense though, because you two decided together.
Yes. Right. Okay, so then maybe it's not a power differential.
It's not a power differential.
I guess we're thinking in terms of, like, maybe I want to, I don't know, maybe I want to enroll a kid in a sport and Curtis doesn't agree, right? Curtis doesn't want to. Then would I have more power in that instance because I'm the one that runs the whole schedule for our family?
Well, I think in that case, this, in my view, would go into conflict resolution because you ought to have an equal say what your kids do.
Okay.
I mean, I understand that you're the one who's doing the transporting and you're organizing a lot of the activities for the kids, but I think you ought to have a discussion on, say, the reason that Curtis wouldn't want your child in a particular sport, at least to listen, so that you have a joint decision. But I think what you're talking about is, that division of labor, which I think works really well.
Yeah.
For most couples, but I see that in a very different way.
Okay.
You sat down and you've decided dividing up because it makes more sense.
Yeah. And it's not that there can't be instances where one couple can have more power than the other. So if you think in terms of sexuality, one partner wants sex and the other one doesn't. Now that I think it's something to talk about and be aware of, because the partner who doesn't want sex has the power because they have something the other person wants, right? And again, if there's conflict there, hopefully you have a good enough relationship and you have good conflict resolution that you can maybe find a balance, or you can find a way to, I guess, resolve that conflict.
Right. And I think that is a case where you do need good conflict resolution. And it's certainly a hard one, but I think it's one that couples can solve.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not that there can't be an imbalance of power in a relationship. It's just, as a whole, hopefully that in general, there shouldn't be a power differential in a relationship. Right. All right. So this topic stems from a video, and Jimmy on relationships. So he is on Instagram. He puts out a lot of funny videos on relationships. They all have this, I mean, I like the underlying message, right? I mean, because he's talking about good functioning of relationships, but he does it in a humorous way where, he portrays both the wife and the husband, right? He puts on a wig and portrays the part of the wife. And anyways, and that's where this video stems from. And the reason why I like this video is because I appreciated the way that they resolved the conflict. Now, I want to acknowledge the conflict resolution is not always this easy.
Right.
Easy as it is portrayed to be in this video.
I just want to acknowledge, I think that Jimmy has borrowed the idea from a very old video called It's Not About the Nail.
Yes.
And so if people want, an alternate, well, it's not really alternative, but it's almost exactly the same, except it goes a little bit more in depth, and it's called It's Not About the Nail. and you can find that on YouTube. Anyway, I think he was kind of liberal in the way he borrowed that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely think so. And so the whole premise of this video is it's not about the dishes.
Right.
So,
it's not.
right. And so in this video, the couple, they're fighting, they're having this argument about doing the dishes, and it goes into several different areas. He's like, "Oh, don't say I never do the dishes because I do." And they're just it escalates. And then all of a sudden the husband says, "This is one of those moments, isn't it? Where they talked about in marriage counseling, we're not really fighting about the dishes." And she goes, "It kind of feels like we're fighting about the dishes." And he goes, "No, it's deeper than that. It's what the dishes represent." And so that is what I want to focus on is oftentimes conflict or frustration, it almost always stems from an unmet need or expectation. Now, one thing that is inevitable in life, or at least in marriage, is conflict. Like it is going to happen. And it doesn't mean that there is something wrong. I think that's another thing that I want to really emphasize is that conflict is normal, but it doesn't mean that your marriage isn't working if you have conflict.
Right. And I really want to emphasize that having conflict does not mean you have to have a fight.
Yes.
So those two are not the same.
Yeah.
I can have a conflict and I don't have to fight about it.
Right. So this brings me back to mine and Curtis's first year of marriage. I would say we disagreed on like 90% of everything. And it's not that we were fighting, it's just we had a lot of conflict resolution that first year in marriage. And, 12 years down the road, everything is pretty good and we don't have nearly as much conflict, but there was a lot. And so I really like that conflict doesn't have to be bad. It just means you have to come to an agreement on something. I mean, when you first get married, we've said this over and over again, you're taking too many cultures and bringing them together. There's going to be conflict there.
Right. And I think it takes 5 to 10 years.
Yep.
For a married couple to figure out how to be married because of that. Yeah. Because you're, figuring out what does this look like as a couplehood as opposed to being two individuals. I also think that I used to know the percentage of this. I think Gottman probably did in his studies figured out what percentage of couple issues are about power and control. I can't remember what it's quite high. So and so, when you're looking at the video and it's not about the dishes, I don't know that you could say, well, it's about this thing or it's about that thing. I think you have to be aware that there are other possibilities. One of them being that it could be about power and control, or from maybe a more general perspective, maybe one of you feels like you aren't being heard, or that the other person gets to say how things are all the time. See, that's more about power and control. So the other thing, here's a good takeaway. I always like my takeaways. Sometimes I do them at the end of the podcast, but here we're doing it at the start. That and this is true. And you might think about your relationship with Curtis, that in your conflict, if you are having some conflict about something like the dishes, where the conflict got to be small, feel small.
Yes.
And if it feels really big or bigger, maybe not even really big, but if the conflict about anything feels bigger than it ought to, hopefully that's a trigger for one or both of you to step back and say, wait, what is this really about? Because it is always then about something else. When that conflict is bigger than it ought to be, then it's about something else.
Yeah, I mean, because it's normal to have a conflict over, well, I cooked dinner, so you should do the dishes, right? And this video does a really good job of depicting this idea of it getting bigger, because it started about the dishes and then it escalated into, oh, don't say I never do the dishes. I just did them. And she fights back with, it doesn't count if I did 90% of the dishes before and you only did the last 10%. That doesn't count. At that point, it's escalating. It's getting bigger. And so that's when you want to step back and say, okay, what else is going on here?
Here's the second takeaway for our listeners. Don't use absolutes.
Yeah.
Never is an absolute. Always is an absolute. Because here's the problem. As soon as you say you never do something, then what happens is the person who you've said that to, you lose focus on what the issue is, and they're thinking, wait, here are the times that I did do that. They shift from whatever the issue is to trying to disprove the absolute statement. And so I think this is good. I really believe this, that couples need to get rid of using absolutes in whenever you're having a conflict.
Yep. So what you said leads very well into Gottman criticism versus complaints.
Complaint, yeah.
Yes. Now they're subtle, but it's the subtle difference that is very important here. So criticism would be, you always do this, you never do that, right? That would be more of an absolute. Whereas a complaint is, I noticed that you oftentimes will not put your dishes in the sink. That is a complaint. Or I noticed that you will often leave your socks on the floor, or you don't put your towel in the hamper, right?
Let me give you a different example, because Gottman frames it a little bit differently.
Okay.
And here's how he would frame it. Like the criticism is about, there's something wrong with you. Like often I've never done this, I don't think. But I hope I've never done it. But I hear it all the time in my office, where one will say to the other, "What's wrong with you? You always do, X." And so the implication that something is wrong with you.
Yeah.
That's almost always present in the criticism. Now, the difference with a complaint is specific. And so this is what it would look like. You would say to your partner, "Last night you left your shirt on the floor, and I would really appreciate it if you would pick up your shirt and put it in the hamper." So do you see, the complaint is very specific?
Yes.
See, even when you say you often do this, it's too unspecific. And so from Gottman's perspective, the more you can look at something like, "You know what, dear, you left your dishes in the sink again last night, and it's really helpful for me when you put the dishes and put them in the dishwasher." See, that's a specific complaint.
Yeah.
As opposed to, "What's wrong with you? You always leave your dishes in the sink."
Why are you so lazy?
That's why are you so lazy? That's a criticism. Never going to go over well. And
no,
so
it doesn't.
He really believes, well, it's one of his four horsemen, that often exist in marriages that are struggling. And, he thinks that the solution to a criticism is to change everything to a complaint, which you can.
Yeah.
I mean, you really can, because often the criticism is triggered by a specific event. So go with the specific event.
Yes. And the thing is in relationships, you have to learn how to have these conversations. Right. I mean, you have to learn how to talk about things that are bothering you, or things that you would like to change.
Right.
That's critical. And, again, it doesn't have to be a fight, but it is a conflict. Right. And so, and again, and I think that's important to distinguish. And so one of the things that I think is also important to learn, or an important skill that everybody should learn, is learning to take feedback from somebody. That's just a good life skill to have. Nobody likes getting feedback. And, I know that some people call it criticism, and then you try to say constructive criticism. Just because you put a positive in front of a negative doesn't make it positive.
No, it doesn't. It's still criticism. That's what Gottman would say. It doesn't matter what word you put in front of it.
Yeah. And so, but a complaint is more like feedback. And, that's an important skill to learn. It's going to take you far in terms of like a career. If somebody can come to you and say, "This is what you need to do better, this is what you did wrong," and if you can learn to not get defensive immediately when that happens, that's critical. I mean, I think that's an important life skill that everybody needs to learn.
Right. But I think that you brought up, say, in business or in the workplace, and still, again, there's a difference. There's typically a power imbalance. And so I think that in a relationship, in a marriage, what keeps something from moving from conflict into a fight is what I call process. It's how you listen to each other. And so, many episodes we've talked about those steps of really being able to listen and understand, and validation and empathy. And so if someone comes to you and says, "I don't like the way you put the dishes in the dishwasher," or something like that, then you ought to be able to have a conversation that says, "What don't you like about it? Or what is hard about this? What happens when I put the dishes in the dishwasher that way for you?" And so instead of just pushing back against it, go into it. I call it going into it. Like, if you don't like the way I do the dishes, I should want to know why. Like, what is it about it? What don't you like about it? And then the validation, if you remember, the validation is, I may not agree with you. Like, I may not think that it matters how the dishes go in the dishwasher, but for whatever reason, it's really important to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it's okay to say, okay, this is important to you, so I'll do it that way.
Yeah. Right. And yeah, and you need to know like what is important to you and what's
Yeah,
not. Like
yeah.
because if it is something really important to you, I mean, maybe you do really care about the way the dishes are done.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and the dishes, if that's a minor thing, it could be something larger in terms of how much money you're saving a month, right? And so that
It could be that, yeah.
yeah,
And
it
so
could
you want to know, you want to have a conversation that lets you know that.
yes. And so again, if it can be a conflict, but it doesn't have to be a fight. So let's talk about the two types of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Conflict that happens in the moment and planned conflict. What are your thoughts on that? On conflict in the moment versus planned conflict?
Well, it's a really good point. And I try and help couples probably do more planned conflicts. And here's the
Yeah.
reason why.
Yeah.
Is that I think, like, oftentimes, I mean, if we're using the dishes, it doesn't matter what the issue is.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a problem with it, I've probably been thinking about it and it's been
Mm-hmm.
spinning in my head. And then I approach my partner with, I have all these thoughts, right? I'm pretty
Mm-hmm.
clear on what I think about it. My partner isn't, because the partner's just learning about this right now.
Yeah.
And so they're often caught off guard. And in some way, there's a little bit of an imbalance there, in that I've thought about it, you haven't. So in some way, I have a little bit more power in the conversation. So I think if you can say, hey, I'd really like to talk to you about how we put the dishes in the dishwasher. Could we do that, later tonight after dinner?
Mm-hmm.
What that does is it gives your partner the opportunity to think about it.
Yeah.
And they may not think about it in any great depth, but at least they're aware that it's going to be an issue for you. And at least from what I've seen, I think that works much better.
Yes. Yeah. And
So I'm a favor. I guess, in answer to your question, I'm pretty much in favor of planned conflict. Sometimes that can't happen,
yeah.
and it's right in the moment. I mean, so I'm not saying to our listeners, all your conflict ought to be planned conflict. I think when you can, it's
Yeah.
better, because you want to do this when you're not quite so worked up, too,
Right. Right.
about something, and you have time to calm down. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, a lot of positive reasons to put it off. Here's the other, and I've got a lot of takeaways today. Here's the other thing: you don't need to solve every problem right now.
True.
You just
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah. I mean, if it's, I can think of, I mean, where are we going to live when you finish, graduate school?
Yeah.
Well, I just started my graduate program yesterday. Do we really have to solve this right now?
Well, plus you'd want to have I mean, something like that, you'd probably want to have more than one conversation about it,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
over time. But I think that, planning the conflict, setting the time. I think context is really important.
Yeah.
Like, if you're in the middle, if the kids are around, if you have kids, the kids are around. Don't I really think it's important for couples most of the time not to have
Yeah.
conflict around the kids if you're going to talk about stuff. Do it privately. Although now there is an alternate way to think about that, and we don't need to go into this. But if your children see you resolving conflict in a very peaceful,
Hmm.
rational, and quiet way, that's not a bad thing to let them see.
I think,
But you do have to be careful about
yeah. And I think, again, that really comes down to the context of it. Because if it's about the
it.
dishes, yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. Let the kids see that conflict resolution. That would be great.
Yeah,
But if
right.
it's about, if it's about something much more serious, like we're having this internal problem that we're trying to solve that's maybe personal, or if it's
Right.
maybe, or if it involves one of their siblings, then don't let that be a conflict resolution
Right.
easy.
Or if say there's a conflict around what sport the kid's going to play.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to be the parental team first.
Hmm.
You want to you want to be on the same page, first. And then and it's not saying you don't involve the child in the discussion at some point, or the
Right.
decision. It's just, you do your work first as the parents, and then you go to the child and you
Yeah.
listen to the child. So you're right. That sometimes you have to put the conflict on hold. But if it's calm and you come to a pretty easy resolution, that's a good thing for kids to see, how to do
Yeah.
conflict resolution.
Yeah, I mean, because and it's not to say that it can't happen in the moment. I mean, because, maybe your partner just started doing something with the dishes and it just started bothering you, and you in
Hmm.
the moment say, "Hey, could we do it this way instead?" That's
Hmm.
conflict resolution. It doesn't seem like it, but it is.
Yep.
Right? That's and
Right.
and if you can peacefully say, "Oh yeah, sure," or, "Well, no, there's a reason why I do this." Again, that's a good thing for kids to see. But,
Hmm. Yep.
maybe don't have an argument about, moving to another state in front of your kids.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah. Don't resolve that conflict in front of them. So, a harsh startup versus a soft startup. We've kind of
Hmm.
already talked about this, but it's worth really clarifying that if you're going to bring up a conflict, my biggest thing is what you said is picking an appropriate time to do
Hmm.
it, right? And really a part of that is it's not just timing as in like what's going on around the house, but what's going on in your partner's emotional world,
Right.
right? I mean, and
Yep.
knowing like, oh, they had a really stressful day at work. Okay, maybe this is not a good night. If it can wait, sometimes it
Right.
can't.
Don't do that when they walk in the door if if they've had a
Y-
stressful night. But
Yeah,
see, that's another reason for planned
yeah.
conflict
Hmm.
is that you're much less likely to have a harsh startup. In fact,
Yeah,
I mean, I think if you had planned conflict, that your chance of having that soft startup is really high
yeah, yeah.
for both of you.
And right. And again, it's all about the process or it's all about the
Hmm.
approach. So,
Yeah.
if I come up to you and I say, Mark, that was really stupid. Why did you do it that way?
So that's not good process,
No, even though I
right?
I didn't sound, but I didn't sound angry. I wasn't angry when
No,
I said it,
no, but
but
it's going to make me defensive.
right. Whereas if I said, so you did this way and I didn't really care for that. Can we have a conversation about this? Or I
Hmm.
need to talk about this. So it's not just about your tone of voice.
Right,
Words matter.
right, right.
And now, when conflict does happen in the moment, or when the conflict, I guess, gets escalated, or when things get heated, and again, just because this is happening doesn't mean that there's something wrong when your marriage. It just means that you're human beings. And so I think you need to understand what flooding is. So you need to
Oh, right.
understand
Yeah.
and be self-aware of what it means to flood. And
Hmm.
so therapists can help couples see the physiological when they're starting to flood, so they can monitor their heart rate, their blood pressure, they can even monitor their brain waves, and they can physically help you see this is it, that you're flooding, right? Because your emotions are high and you're too heated. And when that happens, when you flood, you start to lose rationality and the conversation is going to be very unproductive.
Right. And, I mean, we call that biofeedback, and
Hmm.
biofeedback, I think, used to be a lot bigger. I used to have heart rate monitors that I put on couples, and I still do occasionally for people who are suffering with anxiety. But
Hmm.
Gottman believes that if your heart rate goes above 100 beats per minute, then that at that point you really should stop because nothing good is going to happen. And so
Yeah.
I have suggested to couples often that they will get a heart rate monitor and put it on, because what will happen is if you start to flood, your heart rate's going to start going up before you realize it. And
Hmm.
and so I think we've used the word trigger often in our podcast. And so if you're triggered, I think what you're talking about is a subject where, one or both of you are being triggered, then you're going to flood and your heart rate's going to go up. And here's the interesting thing about heart rate. I've done this with clients, is we are really good at controlling our heart rate if we focus.
Hmm.
Because I had a client with, it was anxiety, and we talked about something that really, we were watching our heart rate. It just, went right up. And so I said, okay, now just focus on bringing your heart rate down. That's all I said. And she did. And you can bring it down pretty easily. And
Yeah. I
and you
treat,
can also go off and, calm yourself. I mean, that's one way to
sh-
do it. But it's just,
sure.
listeners ought to be aware that heart rate is one of those things we have some control over.
Yes, and so I learned to do this when I was donating plasma.
Hmm.
I learned to do that. And part of it I was curious how low I could bring my blood pressure and my heart rate,
Hmm.
and I was able to bring it low enough that they had to make me wait 5 minutes because it was too low.
Uh-huh.
So you're right, but it takes planning. Like it's not something
Uh-huh.
that you can just start doing,
No, it
right?
takes
And
practice. But that's what I'm suggesting to
yes,
listeners, is that you can actually practice this.
Yeah.
Get a heart rate monitor,
Mm-hmm.
force it to go up, and then bring it down,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll find out that you can. A lot of people, I don't know if everybody can do this, but a lot of people can do it pretty easily.
Yeah. Another thing to be aware of, and this is something, and I'm bringing this up because my family struggles with that, and that is the volume of your voice.
Mm,
So in
yeah.
in my in my family, when we get excited about something, our voice goes up. We
Uh-huh.
all do it, and people are like, "Why are you shouting? Like, why are you yelling at me?" And it's like, "No, they're not. He's not yelling at you. He's just excited." And it's something to keep in mind, right? And it's another one of those things where it's just be self-aware.
Right, but you're also talking about the two mini cultures coming
Mhm.
together, because in one
Mhm.
culture, you're used to having the raised voices and you realize it doesn't mean anything. But for the other person, it may mean, oh my gosh, this person is really angry right now.
Yeah.
So I have to be careful. And in that case, you really need to work. I mean, I try and approach it from both perspectives, meaning you got to bring your voice down, you got to bring the
Mhm.
volume down.
Mhm.
And for the other person, you've got to learn to be more comfortable with, increased volume. I mean, you've got to meet somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I
and,
agree with
and that
that.
usually feels right to couples, and I think it's something that they can work on. I think usually, though, from my experience in the office, it's usually the male voice that gets louder, and it's usually deeper, and so it feels angrier even when the man is not. When he at least says, "I'm not really angry," but his voice sure sounds angry. And I can point that out. The wife usually supports that, says, yeah, that's my experience. And so I
Mhm.
think men have to be careful, more
Right.
careful. And it's just because our voices are deeper. And I think it doesn't mean necessarily we're angry, but you can sound angry, and it can be scary for kids and for your
Mhm.
spouse.
Yeah. And again, I being aware, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something wrong or that you are wrong. It's just a biological fact,
Right,
I
right.
guess you
Yep.
could call it. And again, it's something to be aware of. And it is males in my family that are
Hmm.
known for just being really angry. And I'm like, no, dad's not angry. He's just
Yeah,
excited. Like he's just passionate about this. And so
yeah.
it sounds like he's yelling, but he just really cares a lot.
Right. Well, you bring up a good point, and I try and point that out. I think passion often sounds like anger.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you need to be able to point that out and say, and usually it's triggered by someone who grew up in a home where there were angry voices.
Mm-hmm.
They marry someone who might be passionate, and their voice goes up, and that's a trigger, and they don't know if it's anger. I mean, for
Yeah.
them, they think it is anger. And
Right.
so you really need to talk about, what does passion look like, how is it different. So you're
Mm-hmm.
right. I would call that it's a biological or physiological characteristic of some people, that they just sound loud, and for a lot of people, loudness equates to anger,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not necessarily so.
Yep. Yeah. Again, just something to be aware of. So taking a timeout, I think that is an
Hmm.
essential skill in conflict resolution is knowing when to say, I've hit my point. I can't do this right now. I need to step back from this. And one of the things that you've talked about in the past that I think is important is giving it a set time
Yeah.
because otherwise it can quickly turn into stonewalling or just avoiding the problem. If you say, I can't do this, I'm heated, I need a break, I got to step away from this, then that's very ambiguous, right? Whereas
Right.
if you say, I can't handle this conversation, give me 10 minutes to recollect myself, or even, this is too much for me, I need a day to process, right? And
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that you have to spend the next day in stony silence towards each other. It just means we need to put a pin in this and we need to find a way to get back to this equilibrium until I'm ready to discuss this again.
Right. And it's really important with timeouts that you have a specific goal, and the goal is to
Yeah.
calm yourself down.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to say to the other person, I really need to calm myself down, and I'm going to go do that. Now, how we calm ourselves is really specific to each person. And
Mhm.
the one thing to be aware of is, if you want to go outside and walk around the block to calm yourself down, anytime you leave the house in conflict and taking the time out, you have to say to the person,
Yeah.
I am leaving the house. I'm just going to go walk around the block. Now, I have run into some people, I don't know why this is calming, but they think getting in their car and driving is calming. I suppose it's where you're driving. Anyway, if you do that,
Yeah.
be sure you say, I'm
Yeah.
going to go take a drive for 15 minutes. I'll be back. So again, I don't know that it matters what you're
Right.
doing to calm yourself. Just be aware of what it is that works for you and let your partner know what you're
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And, the best thing is with that, or the best reason to do that is it's going to help you avoid saying something you regret. Right.
doing. Right.
Because
Yes.
once
Yes.
you can't take back words, and it's so easy to say something in the heat of the moment, and it's very hurtful, and you can't take that back. Now you can resolve it, you can move past it, but you don't want to be in that position. And so that's the main idea
Yeah.
of just a calming down, of saying, I'm heated, I need to take a minute. Or another thing is like, is if this conflict just isn't going anywhere, right? You can't find a resolution. And maybe it's not a fight, right? Maybe it's not a heated conflict, but you're discussing something and it's very, very important and it's a big deal, and you can't come to a resolution. Then I think it's okay to say, all right, let's take a step back and think about this, and think about everything that we've said, and think more about this, and come back, in X amount of time and discuss it.
I think it's important skill because it goes back to what I said earlier. You don't need to resolve everything right now.
Yeah.
And so
Yep.
if it feels like you're in an impasse, or if it gets late at night, see, I think that's the other
Yeah.
thing. If you often these conversations happen later in the evening if you have kids when the kids are in bed.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just don't want to go on till 1 or 2 in the morning
Oh, yeah.
because, being tired isn't going to help your process either. So it's okay to say, let's think about this. Let's come back together tomorrow at this time and we can take that up. So
Yeah.
really important for people. You don't have to resolve the conflict right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Some conflict does need to be
Yeah.
resolved in the moment, right? I mean, that does happen.
Well,
And
yeah, yeah, but it doesn't, there's some that doesn't have.
yeah,
Where you're
if
going to
it's
move after graduate school does not need,
no,
need to be resolved right now.
no, or what age we're going to let our child start dating doesn't
No,
need to
it
be
doesn't need to be
resolved.
resolved right now
I mean,
because
they were just born
you've
yesterday.
got a few years.
Yeah.
Right.
Or, are we going to do, are they going to go to public school or private school? Well, I
Right.
don't know. It's 6 months old. I don't think they care at this.
But you have a long time to figure that out.
Yeah. So, I think that's, again, those are things that it's worth knowing. I mean,
Yeah.
now if it's, oh, I don't know, this child is sick and I think they need to go to the emergency room. Well, I
Yeah,
don't
you
think they're
got to
sick
resolve
enough.
it right. Got to
That
resolve it right now.
yeah. So I mean, like, right, know the conflict, know yourself, know your spouse.
Yes. Yep.
Right. And I think another one final takeaway for me is, don't expect perfection in conflict resolution. Right.
Yeah.
And so, you're going to get heated. You're going to flood. You're probably going to say things you regret. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with your spouse or there's something wrong with your marriage. It just means you're human beings and you can try again, because I promise you, there's going to be another conflict. If there's
Yeah.
not another conflict, then you can be worried that something is wrong in your marriage.
Well, I mean, I think after so many years, like Lindy and I, after 46 or however many years, there are very few conflicts just because we've had them all.
True. Yeah.
In the 40 years, it's not that we didn't have conflict.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of running out of conflicts. I have one more takeaway. Can I have one more?
Yes.
This comes from Gottman.
Okay.
And I have seen this work so many times in my office. And he shows this to be true in his research, that the fastest way to decrease the conflict is for each person to acknowledge to the other what their part was in the conflict. And so if you say, well, here's what I did, and I'm sorry about it, or I regret it. If you each do that, I've seen it happen. It just brings everything down and you can have a calm conversation. And so that's one of the skills that couples ought to be able to practice, is really acknowledge your own part in whatever's going on. And if you both do it, it makes it so much easier.
That has served me very well over the course of my 12 years of marriage, is whenever I am annoyed with Curtis, or if I'm just in a general grumpy mood, I turn it inward and say, what can I do? Right? What can I do different? How can I help this situation? So yeah, again, just taking ownership, taking responsibility.
Yeah, that's it. Take ownership of your part.
Yeah. Because 99.9% of the time, there are two sides to the story.
Each have a part.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, it's one person does not a marriage make.
No.
And one person does not a divorce make. Right. Yeah. It most of the time. Right. And that's so right. Like it takes two.
Yep.
Okay. So next week we are going to get into family secrets. So that's going to be a good episode, and we're going to talk about why they don't work.
Yes, exactly.
All right. And so I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.